For months, the world believed the Middle East was slowly stepping back from the edge. Diplomats were talking, secret negotiations were underway, oil markets were calming, and after years of confrontation, many believed a dangerous chapter might finally be coming to an end. Then, in a matter of hours, everything changed. Israeli warplanes struck targets in Beirut. Hezbollah launched rockets toward northern Israel. Iran fired ballistic missiles. And suddenly, a region that appeared to be moving toward diplomacy found itself staring once again at the possibility of a wider war. But here's what most headlines aren't telling you. The missiles are only part of the story. Behind every airstrike, behind every rocket launch, behind every diplomatic statement, a much larger struggle is taking place. A struggle involving Israel, Iran, Hezbollah, the United States, global energy markets, and potentially the future balance of power across the Middle East. Because right now, several powerful actors are all trying to achieve very different goals. Israel wants security, Iran wants influence, Hezbollah wants survival, the United States wants a deal, and the problem is that all four objectives may be impossible to achieve at the same time. In this video, we're going to examine why Lebanon has suddenly become the center of a geopolitical storm, why Iran appears willing to take greater risks than many expected, why American policymakers may be running out of options, and why a narrow stretch of water thousands of miles away could end up affecting gasoline prices, inflation, and economies across the globe. Because what happens next won't stay in the Middle East, and the next few weeks could determine whether this crisis begins cooling down or becomes something much larger. Chapter 1. The moment everything changed. To understand why recent events matter, we need to go back just a few days, because before the latest escalation, there were actually signs that tensions were easing. Not peace, not even a ceasefire, but something that looked like a workable arrangement. For nearly a week, Hezbollah largely refrained from launching rockets into northern Israel. At the same time, Israel avoided major strikes against Hezbollah's strongholds in Beirut's southern suburbs. For a brief moment, it appeared that both sides had found an informal understanding, an understanding that allowed each side to step back without formally conceding anything. But these arrangements are fragile, and fragile arrangements often collapse when one side believes the balance is shifting against them. That's exactly what appears to have happened. As Israeli military operations continued in southern Lebanon, pressure on Hezbollah increased. Then came renewed rocket fire. Israel responded, and suddenly Iran entered the picture directly. To understand why that matters, we need to discuss a concept that military strategists obsess over: deterrence. Deterrence is the idea that you prevent hostile actions by convincing your opponent that the cost will be too high. It's not about winning a fight. It's about preventing the fight from happening in the first place. The challenge is that deterrence only works when both sides agree on where the red lines are. And right now, Israel and Iran appear to have very different ideas about those red lines. Israel believes it must retain freedom of action against Hezbollah. Iran believes Hezbollah must be protected from further degradation. Those positions are fundamentally incompatible, and that's why recent events are so significant. Because this isn't simply about individual airstrikes, it's about competing attempts to establish new rules for the entire conflict, rules that neither side currently agrees upon. The danger here isn't necessarily that either side wants a major war. In fact, many analysts believe neither side wants one. The danger is something more subtle. Each side believes its actions are defensive. Each side believes it is restoring deterrence. And each side believes the next move will force the other side to back down. History suggests that situations like this can become dangerous very quickly, because when everyone believes they're acting defensively, escalation becomes surprisingly easy. Chapter 2. Why Hezbollah matters so much. To understand why Iran is behaving the way it is, you first need to understand Hezbollah, and to understand Hezbollah, you need to go back more than 40 years. The modern Middle East was transformed in 1979. That year, the Iranian Revolution overthrew the Shah and brought a new Islamic government to power. For Iran's new leaders, survival became the central objective. The country faced external threats: regional rivals, international isolation, and eventually a devastating war with Iraq. These experiences shaped Iranian strategic thinking for decades. One lesson became not rely solely on conventional military power. Instead, it began developing networks of allied organizations throughout the region, organizations that could extend Iranian influence far beyond its borders. And among all of those relationships, one would become especially important: Hezbollah. Founded in Lebanon during the early 1980s, Hezbollah emerged during a period of enormous regional turmoil. Lebanon itself was engulfed in civil war. Foreign armies operated on Lebanese territory, and different communities were competing for power and survival. Within this environment, Hezbollah grew from a relatively small movement into one of the most powerful non-state military organizations in the world. Over time, the relationship between Hezbollah and Iran deepened. Iran provided support, training, resources, technology, strategic guidance. In return, Hezbollah became one of Tehran's most valuable regional partners. Many analysts describe Hezbollah as Iran's forward line of defense. Others describe it as a strategic deterrent. Regardless of the terminology, the core idea is the same. Hezbollah gives Iran influence and leverage that extends beyond Iran's borders. And that's why recent events in Lebanon matter so much. Because from Tehran's perspective, Hezbollah is not simply another ally, it's one of the pillars of Iran's regional strategy. Imagine spending decades building a strategic asset, investing resources, building relationships, developing capabilities, and then watching that asset gradually weaken under sustained military pressure. At some point, doing nothing becomes risky. That's the dilemma Iran appears to be facing today. Israeli operations have reportedly continued targeting Hezbollah infrastructure in southern Lebanon. According to multiple assessments, Hezbollah has been weakened significantly, not eliminated, but weakened. And that distinction matters, because a weakened Hezbollah creates opportunities for Israel, but it also creates incentives for Iran to become more involved. The more pressure Hezbollah faces, the more likely Iran may feel compelled to respond. And that's where the story becomes more dangerous. Because once regional powers begin acting directly to protect strategic interests, the risk of escalation increases dramatically. Yet there's another layer to this story, one that receives far less attention: the political dimension. Military conflicts are rarely driven purely by military considerations. Politics matters, public opinion matters, elections matter. And leaders often face domestic pressures that outsiders don't fully appreciate. In Israel, security remains one of the most important political issues. Rocket attacks against northern communities create pressure. Military setbacks create pressure. Perceptions of weakness create pressure. Meanwhile, in Iran, leaders face a different challenge. Backing down can be portrayed as weakness. Allowing key regional partners to suffer defeats can damage credibility. Appearing unable to defend allies can weaken deterrence elsewhere. As a result, both sides face incentives that encourage firmness rather than compromise. And that's exactly why diplomacy becomes so difficult during moments like this. Because even when leaders privately want de-escalation, domestic politics may push them toward escalation. But Hezbollah is only one piece of the puzzle. Because behind the fighting in Lebanon, another battle is taking place. A battle involving billions of dollars, nuclear negotiations, economic pressure, and a diplomatic process that may determine whether this crisis escalates or stabilizes. And that's where the story gets even more complicated. Because while missiles dominate the headlines, the future of this conflict may actually depend on negotiations happening hundreds of miles away behind closed doors. Chapter 3: The negotiation nobody is talking about. When most people think about international crises, they imagine missiles, fighter jets, and military commanders. But some of the most important battles never appear on a battlefield. They take place in hotel conference rooms, private residences, encrypted phone calls, and diplomatic channels hidden from public view. Because while Israel and Hezbollah exchange fire, another struggle is unfolding: a negotiation between the United States and Iran. And despite all the attention focused on military events, This negotiation may ultimately determine whether the region moves toward de-escalation or confrontation. The challenge is that both sides appear convinced that time is on their side. Iran believes economic pressure alone will not force major concessions. The United States believes economic pressure eventually will. Both sides are waiting, both sides are testing, and neither side appears eager to blink first. At the center of the dispute are three major issues: money, sanctions, and Iran's nuclear program. For years, billions of dollars connected to Iran have remained frozen in various countries around the world. Iran wants access to those funds. The United States wants concessions in exchange. Simple in theory, extremely complicated in practice, because neither side trusts the other. Iran worries that it could make concessions only to discover promised benefits never materialize. Washington worries that providing benefits too early would remove leverage. The result is a classic diplomatic standoff. And then there's the nuclear issue. This is where negotiations become even more difficult. American officials want stronger limitations on Iran's nuclear activities. Iran insists that its program is peaceful and resists demands it views as excessive. For years, this issue has been one of the most controversial topics in international politics. Supporters of diplomacy argue that negotiated restrictions reduce risk. Critics argue that negotiations merely delay future problems. Regardless of which side you agree with, one reality remains. Without progress on the nuclear issue, a broader agreement becomes much harder to achieve. And that's where Lebanon suddenly becomes relevant again. Because every missile launched in Lebanon affects the political environment surrounding negotiations, every airstrike changes calculations, every escalation increases pressure on decision-makers. Diplomacy does not occur in a vacuum, and when military tensions rise, political space for compromise tends to shrink. This creates a dangerous cycle. The conflict makes negotiations harder. The lack of negotiations makes conflict more likely. And the longer that cycle continues, the greater the risk that events begin driving policy rather than the other way around. Chapter 4: Why July Could Change Everything. One theme keeps appearing in discussions among analysts: time. Not because of any magical date, not because a specific deadline guarantees a breakthrough, but because pressure accumulates. Governments can tolerate uncertainty for a while. Markets can tolerate uncertainty for a while. Voters can tolerate uncertainty for a while. But eventually, costs begin rising, and that's when incentives change. Some analysts believe that as summer progresses, economic and political pressures may become harder to ignore. If diplomacy remains stalled, leaders may face increasingly difficult choices: continue waiting, make concessions, or escalate. None of those options are particularly attractive. Which is exactly why the next several weeks matter so much, because right now everyone still has room to maneuver. That room may not exist forever. Chapter 5: Trump's Dilemma. Every major geopolitical crisis eventually becomes a political crisis, and in Washington the stakes are becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The challenge facing American policymakers is straightforward to describe, much harder to solve. On one hand, pressure creates leverage: economic pressure, diplomatic pressure, military pressure. All can influence negotiations. On the other hand, pressure creates risks: higher energy prices, market volatility, political backlash, and uncertainty. For any administration, this balancing act would be difficult, but it becomes even more complicated when domestic politics enter the picture. Every major decision carries consequences. Too much pressure and negotiations may collapse. Too many concessions and critics accuse leaders of weakness. Escalation creates risks. Inaction creates risks. Every path forward contains uncertainty, which helps explain why policymakers often appear contradictory, because they are attempting to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. Reduce tensions, maintain leverage, avoid war, protect economic stability, support allies, pressure adversaries. Those goals sound reasonable individually. Together, they are extraordinarily difficult, and that's why even small developments can suddenly become important. A missile strike, a diplomatic statement, a negotiation leak. Each can shift perceptions about where the crisis is heading. Chapter 7. The Other Players. One mistake people often make is viewing this crisis as a conflict involving only Israel, Iran, and the United States. In reality, many other governments have enormous stakes in the outcome, particularly the Gulf states. Countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain have spent years trying to transform their economies, building financial centers, developing tourism, attracting investment, diversifying beyond oil. All of these ambitions require one thing: stability, which means these countries face a difficult reality. They don't necessarily control the crisis, but they could suffer many of the consequences. That's one reason regional governments have generally supported efforts to reduce tensions, not because they agree on everything, but because prolonged instability threatens economic objectives. This creates an interesting dynamic. Some governments are publicly cautious, others operate behind the scenes, but many share the same broad preference: avoid a larger war. The problem, of course, is that preferences do not always determine outcomes. History contains many examples of conflicts that expanded despite widespread opposition, and that's what makes the current situation so difficult to predict. Chapter 8. Three Futures. As we look ahead, there are three broad scenarios. The first is the optimistic scenario. Diplomacy succeeds, negotiations make progress, tensions gradually decline, the conflict doesn't disappear overnight, but escalation is contained. This remains possible. The second scenario is prolonged uncertainty. No major agreement, no major war, just continued tension, periodic incidents, diplomatic deadlock, a situation where everyone avoids catastrophe but nobody achieves a breakthrough. This may sound stable, but prolonged uncertainty creates its own dangers, because eventually someone miscalculates, eventually pressure builds, eventually circumstances change. Which brings us to the third scenario: escalation. Not necessarily because anyone wants it, but because events create momentum. A strike leads to retaliation. Retaliation leads to counter-retaliation. And before anyone intends it, the conflict expands. Historically, this is how many crises become larger than originally planned, not through a single dramatic decision, but through a series of smaller decisions that collectively produce unexpected outcomes. Which scenario will emerge, no one knows, and anyone claiming certainty is probably oversimplifying a very complex situation. Final chapter. What happens next? The coming weeks will reveal a great deal. Watch Lebanon, watch the negotiations, watch energy markets, and most importantly, watch whether leaders continue leaving themselves room to compromise. Because despite all the headlines, the story isn't really about missiles or even diplomacy. It's about competing visions of security, competing visions of influence, competing visions of what the future of the Middle East should look like. And right now, those visions remain in conflict. The outcome will affect far more than the countries directly involved. It could influence energy markets, global politics, regional alliances, and international stability. For now, the situation remains unresolved, the negotiations remain incomplete, the tensions remain elevated, and the future remains uncertain. Which means the most important chapter of this story may not be the one we've just discussed. It may be the one that's about to unfold. If you've made it this far, let us know in the comments. Do you believe diplomacy will ultimately prevail? Or are we witnessing the early stages of a larger regional confrontation? And if you found this analysis valuable, subscribe for more deep dives into the geopolitical stories shaping our world. Because in an interconnected age, understanding these events isn't just about understanding the Middle East, it's about understanding the future,